For 10 years, a team of scientists worked in near silence beneath the Egyptian desert, inside a room sealed for 33 centuries, trying to solve a mystery that had haunted Egyptology for almost 100 years, and what they eventually found was not what anyone expected. In November 1922, the British archaeologist Howard Carter broke through a plaster doorway in the Valley of the Kings and became the first person in over 3,000 years to lay eyes on the intact burial chamber of a young pharaoh named Tutankhamun. The tomb, known to scholars as KV62, had escaped the wholesale looting that destroyed almost every other royal burial in the valley. Golden shrines, a solid gold, death mask, chariots, jewelry, and thousands of everyday objects, meant to accompany the king into the afterlife, were still exactly where priests had placed them around 1323 BCE. It became, almost instantly, the most famous archaeological discovery in history. But fame came at a cost. What had survived undisturbed for millennia was now about to face its greatest threat. Not thieves, not time, but the sheer number of people who wanted to see it. Carter's discovery took nearly a decade to fully catalog. The tomb consisted of 4 small rooms, an antechamber crammed with dismantled chariots, statues, and boxes of linen, an annex stacked almost to the ceiling with furniture and food supplies, a burial chamber dominated by 4 gilded shrines nested inside one another like Russian dolls, protecting a stone sarcophagus and the pharaoh's nested coffins, the innermost one made of solid gold, and a small treasury, guarded by a statue of the jackal god Anubis, holding canopic jars that once contained the king's internal organs. Tutankhamun himself had died around 1323 BCE, likely in his late teens, after a short and relatively unremarkable reign, notable mainly for reversing the religious upheaval of his father, Akhenaten. In life, he was a minor pharaoh. In death, through sheer archaeological accident, he became the most famous ruler of ancient Egypt, largely because his tomb was small, easily concealed by debris from later construction in the valley, and therefore overlooked by the tomb robbers who stripped nearly every other pharaoh's burial bare within a few generations of it being sealed. Within a few years of the discovery, the tomb was open to tourists. Over the following decades, that trickle of visitors turned into a flood. By the early 2000s, Tutankhamun's tomb was receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, each one bringing body heat, moisture from their breath, and dust carried in on clothing and shoes. Unlike the dry, stable environment the tomb had known for thousands of years, the burial chamber was now experiencing constant fluctuations in humidity and carbon dioxide levels. Egyptian conservators began noticing something troubling on the tomb's famous wall paintings. Small, dark brown spots scattered across the painted plaster, particularly on the north and south walls of the burial chamber. Some officials worried these spots were multiplying, a sign that the tomb itself was slowly being destroyed by the very people who came to admire it. In 2009, Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities made a decision that would define the next 10 years of the tomb's history. They invited the Getty Conservation Institute, one of the world's leading cultural heritage science organizations, to carry out the most comprehensive scientific investigation of the tomb since Carter himself had entered it. This was not going to be a quick repair job. It was a full-scale forensic examination of a 3,000-year-old crime scene, except the culprit wasn't a person. It was time, humidity, biology, and human traffic, all working together in ways nobody had ever properly measured. The scale of the challenge was almost unprecedented in the field of cultural heritage conservation. Most ancient sites that require restoration are architectural ruins, exposed to open air, where scaffolding and modern equipment can move freely. Tutankhamun's burial chamber is roughly the size of a small bedroom cut directly into bedrock, with barely enough space for a handful of conservators to work at any one time, let alone the environmental monitoring equipment, lighting rigs, and scientific instruments the project required. Every tool, every chemical, every piece of equipment brought into that chamber had to be considered not just for what it would do, but for what trace amount of heat, moisture, or vibration it might introduce into an environment that had remained essentially unchanged for 3,000 years before Carter's arrival. The project team described their approach as values-based conservation, a methodology that starts by identifying exactly what makes a site significant, whether that is historical accuracy, artistic integrity, or scientific evidence, and then lets those values guide every subsequent decision, rather than defaulting to whatever restoration technique looks most impressive. The first phase of the project had nothing to do with gold leaf or paintbrushes. It was about data. Conservators and scientists spent years documenting the tomb in obsessive detail, mapping every crack, every flake of paint, every discoloration on the walls, centimeter by centimeter. They installed environmental sensors to track temperature, humidity, and carbon dioxide levels around the clock, comparing tomb conditions when it was empty to conditions when tour groups packed inside. They studied historical photographs going back to the 1920s, comparing them frame by frame with the current state of the walls to determine, scientifically, whether the tomb was actively deteriorating or whether what they were seeing had simply always been there. That last question turned out to be the key to everything. The brown spots had worried Egyptian officials for years, with some fearing they represented an active, spreading infection eating away at one of the most significant art collections on Earth. So the conservation team treated the spots as a genuine scientific mystery. They took microscopic samples, embedded them in resin, and sliced them into cross-sections thinner than a human hair to study their structure under magnification. They ran DNA and chemical analysis to identify exactly what these organisms were. The results, when they came back, offered real reassurance. The spots were indeed biological in origin, almost certainly fungal or microbial growths that had colonized the wet plaster while the tomb was being sealed up in ancient times, feeding briefly on organic material in the paint before running out of moisture and dying. Crucially, the organisms were confirmed to be dead, not active, and posed no ongoing threat to the paintings. When researchers compared the spots against photographs taken in the 1920s, right after Carter's excavation, they found no evidence of new growth. The spots people feared were slowly consuming the tomb had, in fact, been sitting quietly, harmless, for roughly 3,000 years before anyone even discovered the burial chamber. This was, in its own way, the first real answer the project delivered, and it was almost the opposite of dramatic. There was no active infestation, no hidden mold slowly devouring the pharaoh's afterlife. The tomb's paintings were fundamentally stable, but the spots themselves could not simply be scrubbed away for cosmetic reasons, because over 3,000 years they had penetrated into the paint layer itself. Removing them would have meant removing genuine ancient pigment along with them, so conservators made the deliberate, values-driven decision to leave the spots exactly where they were, documenting them permanently instead, treating them as part of the tomb's authentic history rather than a flaw to be erased. With that mystery resolved, the team turned to the paintings themselves. The burial chamber's walls are covered in scenes rendered in a style unusual even for Egyptian tomb art. Golden figures, set against a rich yellow background, depicting Tutankhamun's funeral procession, his welcome into the afterlife by the gods, and passages from the Amduat, the ancient text describing the sun, God's nighttime journey through the underworld. Centuries of dust, soot from torches and early tourist-era candles, and grime had dulled sections of the paintings. Conservators used specialized methods to clean the surfaces without. Stripping away original pigment, working millimeter by millimeric, testing every material and every technique in small hidden areas before applying it anywhere visible. This wasn't the sweeping, theatrical restoration you might imagine. No dramatic unveiling of blinding gold in a single afternoon. It was slow, quiet, incremental work, sometimes advancing only a few square inches in a full day, guided by chemistry and conservation ethics rather than showmanship. At the same time, an entirely separate but equally serious engineering problem was being solved. The tomb's environment had to be brought under control if the paintings were going to survive another century of visitors. The Getty team, working with Egyptian authorities, designed and installed a new ventilation and air filtration system specifically engineered for the confined space of the burial chamber, aimed at managing humidity, filtering dust, and controlling carbon dioxide buildup from crowds of tourists. New walkways and a viewing platform were built so that visitors' feet and bodies would stay a safe distance from the fragile walls. Improved lighting was installed, designed to illuminate the paintings clearly without generating damaging heat. Signage and interpretive materials were added to help visitors understand what they were looking at, and Egyptian conservation staff were trained extensively so that Egypt's own experts, not just international scientists, could monitor and maintain the tomb for decades after the foreign teams packed up and left. The team also had to think about visitor behavior itself, not just the physical environment. Studies conducted during the project examined how many people could safely stand inside the burial chamber at once, how long each group should be allowed to remain, and how camera flashes, filming equipment, and even the simple act of talking and breathing in an enclosed stone room affected humidity readings within minutes. These findings were used to draft new guidelines for tour operators and site managers, covering everything from maximum visitor numbers to rules about filming inside the tomb, a set of recommendations still referenced by Egyptian heritage authorities managing the site today. In effect, the project treated the tourists themselves as part of the environmental system that needed to be measured and managed, alongside humidity, temperature, and airborne dust. While all of this careful, methodical science was happening inside the burial chamber, a very different kind of story was unfolding around the same site. One that would briefly convince the world that Tutankhamun's tomb was about to yield its greatest secret yet. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves published a striking theory. While studying ultra-high-resolution scans of the tomb's walls produced by the digital preservation company Factum Arte, he noticed faint lines beneath the painted plaster on the north and west walls, lines that, he argued, could be the outlines of two sealed, previously unknown doorways. Reeves proposed something extraordinary, that one of these hidden doorways might lead to a continuation of the tomb, and that this hidden chamber could be the final resting place of Queen Nefertiti, the legendary wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten and one of the most famous women in ancient Egyptian history. His theory suggested that Tutankhamun, who died young and unexpectedly, may have been hastily buried in what was originally intended, or already used, as an antechamber to Nefertiti's own tomb, meaning the boy king's burial only occupied part of a much larger royal complex that had never been fully explored. The implications were staggering. If Reeves was right, then for over 90 years, tourists, archaeologists, and Egyptologists had been standing meters away from one of the greatest undiscovered treasures in human history without knowing it. Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities took the theory seriously enough to launch an official investigation. In November 2015, a Japanese radar specialist named Hirokatsu Watanabe conducted infrared thermal scans and ground-penetrating radar surveys of the suspect walls. The preliminary results electrified the archaeological world. At a press conference in Luxor, Egypt's Antiquities Minister at the time announced that the scans showed roughly a 90% likelihood that empty space existed behind the walls, potentially containing organic and metallic material. Headlines around the globe declared that Nefertiti's tomb may have finally been found. Reeves himself stated publicly that the radar evidence looked, in his words, beyond intriguing. But science does not settle for a single test, especially not one this consequential. A second radar scan was carried out in 2016 by a different specialist, and this time the results contradicted the first. No clear evidence of hidden chambers appeared in the new data. Sources close to the investigation, speaking anonymously at the time, indicated the second survey had found no sign of a hidden chamber and no trace of Nefertiti's tomb. The scientific community was now split, with two competing radar surveys pointing in opposite directions, and no way to know for certain which one was correct without a far more rigorous, independent test. The uncertainty left by these conflicting results says a great deal about how difficult it actually is to see through solid rock and ancient plaster without physically breaking through a wall that has protected priceless paintings for 3 millennia. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending electromagnetic pulses into a surface and analyzing how they bounce back, which can reveal changes in density consistent with a hollow space. But the technique is notoriously sensitive to interference from mineral composition, moisture, and even the specific angle at which the equipment is held. Two different specialists, using different generations of equipment, had reached opposite conclusions from the same wall, and neither the Egyptian government nor the international archaeological community was willing to let the question sit unresolved. Given the stakes, both scientifically and in terms of Egypt's cultural tourism industry, only an independent, tightly controlled third investigation would be considered credible enough to settle the matter. That final test came in 2018, when a joint scientific mission coordinated by physicist Franco Porcelli of the Polytechnic University of Turin conducted a third and far more advanced ground-penetrating radar investigation, supported by the National Geographic Society. This survey was designed specifically to resolve the contradiction left by the first two attempts, using more sophisticated equipment and stricter methodology. The results were unambiguous, and they were announced through Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities during an international Tutankhamun conference in 2018. There were no hidden chambers, no sealed doorways, and no lost tomb of Nefertiti waiting behind the painted walls of KV-62. After 3 years of global fascination, expedition funding, media coverage, and genuine scientific effort, the investigation ended not with a discovery, but with a definitive answer that the sensational theory was false. For many people, following the story, that outcome felt like a disappointment. The idea of stumbling onto one of history's most famous missing queens, sealed away just meters from the world's most visited tomb, was irresistible. But for the scientists actually involved, the outcome was, in its own way, just as important as a discovery would have been. It closed a genuine scientific question with hard data instead of speculation, and it demonstrated exactly how modern archaeology is supposed to work. Through testable evidence, replication, and a willingness to accept results, even when they contradict what everyone hoped to find. The mystery of the doorway-shaped lines that started the whole theory was never fully explained, but the specific claim of a hidden burial chamber containing Nefertiti was, according to the best available scientific evidence, put to rest. It is worth pausing on why the Nefertiti theory captured public imagination so completely in the first place. Nefertiti is one of the few ancient Egyptian royal women whose face is instantly recognizable worldwide, largely because of a painted limestone bust of her, created around 1345 BCE, that has been on display in Berlin since the early 20th century and is considered one of the most admired portraits to survive from the ancient world. Despite her fame, her tomb has never been definitively found, and her mummy has never been conclusively identified among the unidentified royal remains recovered from the Valley of the Kings. She represents one of Egyptology's most persistent open questions. So when a credible researcher proposed that her final resting place might be sitting undiscovered behind a wall that hundreds of thousands of tourists had already walked past, it touched a nerve that went far beyond academic circles. It offered the tantalizing possibility that one of history's most famous unsolved mysteries could be solved almost by accident, simply by looking more closely at a room the world already thought it fully understood. That is precisely why the eventual negative result mattered so much. It did not just fail to deliver an exciting headline, it definitively closed off what had briefly seemed like the most promising lead scholars had ever had toward finding Nefertiti's tomb. Back inside the burial chamber, the conservation project pressed on through all of this outside drama, unaffected by the headlines swirling around the tomb's other walls. By January 2019, after nearly a decade of continuous work, the Getty Conservation Institute and Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities announced that the project was complete. It stood as the most thorough scientific study and physical conservation effort the tomb had undergone since Carter's original excavation nearly a century earlier. The wall paintings were confirmed to be in fundamentally stable condition, with only limited flaking in specific areas caused by inconsistencies in the original ancient materials and application techniques used by the artists themselves 3,000 years earlier, rather than by any modern damage. The mysterious brown spots, once feared as an active biological threat, were confirmed dead and left untouched as a permanent, honest part of the tomb's long history. New environmental controls were in place to protect the paintings from the humidity and carbon dioxide produced by future visitors. New walkways kept curious hands and shuffling feet at a safe distance from irreplaceable ancient plaster, and a new generation of Egyptian conservators had been trained to carry this work forward long after the international specialists returned home. Neville Agnew, the senior conservation specialist who led the Getty team throughout the project, described the effort as one that expanded understanding of one of the most storied places in human history, built on systematic planning, scientific investigation, and a deeply sensitive approach to treatment. That sensitivity mattered enormously because every decision made inside that chamber carried real consequences. A single wrong cleaning technique could have permanently erased brushstrokes made by an artist working under torchlight more than 3,000 years ago. A single misjudged environmental change could have accelerated the very decay the project was trying to prevent. Nothing about this work could be rushed, and nothing about it could be undone if a mistake occurred. So, what did scientists actually find after all those years inside Tutankhamun's tomb? Not a hidden burial chamber, not a long-lost queen, not a dramatic new cache of golden treasure waiting behind a secret door. What they found was something quieter, and in many ways more valuable. Proof that the tomb's ancient paintings had survived largely intact for 3,000 years. Evidence that a suspected biological threat was in fact a harmless remnant of the tomb's original ceiling, and a rigorously tested answer arrived at over 3 years and 3 separate scientific surveys that put to rest one of modern Egyptology's most tantalizing theories. They found, in short, the truth, verified not once, but multiple times, using methods far more advanced than anything available to Howard Carter in 1922. It is also worth understanding just how unusual Tutankhamun's tomb art actually is, because that uniqueness is part of why conservators were so careful with it. Egyptian royal tombs typically feature paintings on plastered limestone with a pale background, but the burial chamber of Tutankhamun is painted almost entirely against a deep yellow-gold ground, a stylistic choice rarely seen elsewhere in the Valley of the Kings. Scholars believe this golden background was meant to evoke the sun and the eternal, imperishable nature of the gods, reinforcing the idea that the king was undergoing a divine transformation rather than simply dying. The scenes depict Tutankhamun's mummy being dragged on a sledge by officials during his funeral procession, his successor A performing the opening of the mouth ritual believed to restore the senses to the dead king, and the pharaoh being welcomed by deities including Osiris, Nut, and Hathor into the afterlife. Elsewhere, 12 baboons representing the 12 hours of the night appear in a single continuous strip, taken from the Amduat, guiding the sun god Ra, and by extension the deceased king, safely through the underworld until his rebirth at dawn. Every element of this artwork carried religious meaning that the ancient artists intended to function literally, not merely decoratively, which is exactly why the conservation team treated preserving the original pigment, brushwork, and even the biological staining as a matter of historical integrity rather than simple aesthetics. The financial and logistical scale of the project also deserves mention, because sustained, decade-long conservation efforts of this kind are rare even among world-famous heritage sites. The work required continuous collaboration between an American-based scientific institute and Egyptian governmental authorities across multiple changes in Egypt's political leadership, including the years surrounding the 2011 revolution and its aftermath, a period during which tourism to Egypt and funding tied to it fluctuated dramatically. That the project continued largely uninterrupted through a decade of political and economic upheaval speaks to how seriously both parties treated the tomb's preservation, independent of the broader turbulence surrounding it. Conservation scientists returned to Luxor year after year, sometimes working in stretches of only a few weeks at a time, dictated by funding cycles and site access, slowly accumulating the environmental data, chemical analysis, and painting condition reports that would eventually inform the final restoration decisions. There is something genuinely remarkable in that outcome, even without gold or a hidden queen. A civilization that vanished more than 3,000 years ago left behind a room so precisely constructed, so carefully sealed, that scientists in the 21st century needed nearly a decade of continuous laboratory analysis, environmental monitoring, and international collaboration just to fully understand what they were looking at and to make sure it would survive for future generations to study as well. The real achievement of this project was not a shocking discovery in the way headlines often promise. It was the preservation, through patient and disciplined science, of something irreplaceable, ensuring that a boy king who died more than 3 millennia ago, and the artists who painted his journey into the afterlife, will still be here for people to see 3,000 years from now. The financial and logistical scale of the project also deserves mention, because sustained, decade-long conservation efforts of this kind are rare even among world-famous heritage sites. The work required continuous collaboration between an American-based scientific institute and Egyptian governmental authorities across multiple changes in Egypt's political leadership, including the years surrounding the 2011 revolution and its aftermath, a period during which tourism to Egypt and funding tied to it fluctuated dramatically. That the project continued largely uninterrupted through a decade of political and economic upheaval speaks to how seriously both parties treated the tomb's preservation, independent of the broader turbulence surrounding it. Conservation scientists returned to Luxor year after year, sometimes working in stretches of only a few weeks at a time, dictated by funding cycles and site access, slowly accumulating the environmental data, chemical analysis, and painting condition reports that would eventually inform the final restoration decisions. There is something genuinely remarkable in that outcome, even without gold or a hidden queen. A civilization that vanished more than 3,000 years ago left behind a room so precisely constructed, so carefully sealed, that scientists in the 21st century needed nearly a decade of continuous laboratory analysis, environmental monitoring, and international collaboration just to fully understand what they were looking at, and to make sure it would survive for future generations to study as well. The real achievement of this project was not a shocking discovery in the way headlines often promise. It was the preservation, through patient and disciplined science, of something irreplaceable, ensuring that a boy king who died more than 3 millennia ago, and the artists who painted his journey into the afterlife, will still be here for people to see 3,000 years from now. The Tutankhamun project has since become something of a template for how heritage institutions approach other fragile ancient sites facing the same fundamental tension between public access and long-term preservation. The Getty Conservation Institute had already applied a similar values-based methodology years earlier at the nearby tomb of Queen Nefertari in the Valley of the Queens, widely regarded as one of the most beautifully decorated tombs in Egypt. And lessons from both projects have since informed conservation planning at other endangered sites around the world, from painted caves in China to rock-cut tombs elsewhere in the Middle East. The core lesson is consistent across all of these projects. The greatest threat facing ancient sites today is rarely a single catastrophic event, but the slow, cumulative pressure of popularity itself, and the only real defense against it is patient, long-term scientific monitoring, rather than one-time repairs. For Tutankhamun's tomb specifically, that means the story does not really end with the 2019 completion announcement. The environmental sensors installed during the project continue to feed data to Egyptian conservators. The training given to local staff was designed to be self-sustaining, not dependent on periodic visits from foreign specialists. And the guidelines developed around visitor numbers and behavior remain in place as Egypt continues to balance the economic importance of tourism to the Valley of the Kings against the fragile, irreplaceable nature of what lies inside it. In that sense, the most accurate way to describe what scientists found after a decade inside Tutankhamun's tomb is not a single revelation, but a working system. Verified data on what threatens the paintings, confirmation of what does not, and a functioning plan to keep both realities true for as long as possible. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into history's greatest mysteries and the science behind them. Drop a comment below telling us which ancient discovery you want us to cover next. And give this video a like if you want to see more real, well-researched archaeology on this channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.